Disclaimer, this review is based solely on the first book. I have yet to read the rest of the series, so some of the points I make may become invalid if you know the context of the rest of the series. So take this review more as a first impression, if you will. But that being said, I feel the job of a first book in any series is to allow and prompt the reader to make assumptions about the books and the rest of the series, otherwise what would be the point? That being said, all of the opinions held in this review are mine, and if you agree with them, cool. If you disagree with them, that's fine too. This review is purely for fun. I'll also be referring to this book, A Court of Thorns and Roses, as its shortened counterpart, ACOTAR, because it's easier to say, and that's how the majority of fans refer to the book and the rest of the series as well. So, with that being said, let's get to the review. So here's a bit of context about why I even started reading ACOTAR in the first place. Ever since joining Bookstagram, you can find my socials here, I have seen this book circulating everywhere. If you're a Bookstagrammer and you haven't read or staged a colour-schemed photo shoot of the ACOTAR books, are you even a Bookstagrammer? But seriously, I've seen this book everywhere. Previous to reading the series, I had already heard of Sarah J. Maas. I knew that she had written some other successful series like A Throne of Glass, Crescent City, which I also haven't read, but it's definitely ACOTAR that stands out to me, and that seems to be her most popular series. There's even rumours going around at this point in time that the series is being developed for Hulu by Ronald D. Moore, who writes and produces for Star Trek and Outlander, so the book clearly has some sway in pop culture. I definitely feel that YA fantasy is in its heyday right now. Its impact seems to be gaining a momentum similar to the paranormal romance books and series like Twilight had back in the mid-noughties. The highly successful Shadow and Bone series is coming out on Netflix next month, and Victoria Aveyard has been in talks for the past year about adapting her series Red Queen into a film or TV show. Fantasy is becoming cool again, guys, and I'm kind of here for it. So ACOTAR was published in 2015 by Bloomsbury, and it is a #1 New York Times bestseller. So 6 years later, there's now 5 installments, a novella, and I believe 2 more books confirmed for publishing after the most recent release of A Court of Silver Flames earlier this year. So the series definitely has longevity and big staying power, which I think is at the heart of some of the most successful, popular, longer series like Harry Potter and the Darren Shan books, because readers grow attached and they want to follow the characters and hear the rest of their story. And even just from this first book, I can definitely see why readers would want to. Maas creates a very rich history for her world of Privian, excerpts of which I could easily see becoming further explored and publicised in prequels, series spin-offs or other smaller novels. But after all of the hype and excitement, and as much as I enjoyed reading the novel, it was kind of a letdown for me. But we'll get to that. In brief, ACOTAR follows the story of Feyre, who I have many opinions on, who is a human. Feyre is the youngest of 3 daughters. Her family used to be wealthy, but her mother died, and then shortly afterwards her father lost all of their money in a risky investment and was left crippled after being physically assaulted by his angry creditors. So her family is kind of useless. Feyre is the only one able to hunt and actually keep her family alive. She's the only one who provides any kind of income, and she kind of hates them for that. They're selfish and ungrateful towards her, and you wonder why Feyre even stays with them in the first place, but you find out that she feels bound to them because of the promise she made to her mother on her deathbed to protect them. But as the youngest daughter, Feyre wonders why her mother picked her to be in charge of these duties, and you kind of feel like this might be later explored or revealed in the novel, but it never really is. The mortal world and the world of Privian is one of the most interesting aspects of the book to me. It kind of gives me Neil Gaiman's Stardust vibes in that there are 2 separate realms that know of each other but just kind of coexist. There's a wall to keep each other out, the humans are all squished down into a tiny bit of land after big human versus fairy, and Fairy versus fairy wars took place 500 years prior to the story's events, and because of this, humans hate fairies because the fairies took all of their land, and the fairies hate them back because they think humans are prejudiced and stupid and weak and colonialism anyone. There's a whole other load of backstory and plot to ACOTAR too, which makes it kind of a hefty book to read even for 400 pages because the events unfold really slowly. I would say the important parts of the plot itself could be narrowed down to only 150 pages, the rest is just detail and filler. But essentially Feyre kills a fairy who wanders onto the mortal land in its shapeshifter form, more on that later, and as a result is forced under the treaty made in the resolution of the wars 500 years before to go and live at the Spring Court with the High Fairy Tamlin, who the wolf she murdered was in service to. It's very Beauty and the Beast. They hate each other at first and then kind of fall in love, and then a whole load of other complicated stuff happens. Later you find out that Tamlin and the rest of the Spring Court have been placed under a curse by the bad fairy Amarantha, and you discover that there actually is no treaty and that Tamlin just manipulated Feyre with hopes that she would be the one to break the curse, and you'd think she'd be mad about that, but she just doesn't care because she loves him, and you should probably just read it. Anyway, now the basic plot is out of the way, I thought it would only be fair to analyse and divide the book into elements I liked and elements I didn't like, because as much as it sounds like I might hate this book, I don't. It's not inherently bad, it's just meh. I like Amarantha, who is the villain of this story. We aren't really introduced to her until the last 100 pages, but I think she was one of the best parts of the book. I thought she was well written and cruel and was a cool metaphor for racism and prejudice, and her hatred towards mortals is ultimately what destroys her. She was the only character in a novel who I thought was truly unique and interesting, but she also gets killed off at the end of the book, so... I also like Nesta. She is one of Feyre's sisters. I thought the concept of her character was cool. I liked the fact that even a minor character in this book had a character arc. At first you think she's a cold-hearted, narcissistic person, but later you find out that she's always cared about Feyre, even though she acts like she doesn't. And I appreciated the fact that the spell Tamlin cast to make Feyre's family forget that Feyre has been kidnapped by a giant fairy beast thing also doesn't work because of her stubborn, headstrong nature. She even tries to find Feyre after she's been taken, and I enjoyed that. I'm the eldest of two younger siblings, and if I saw them being taken by a giant beast against their will, I'd like to think that I'd go and try to bring them back, or at least try and prevent their kidnapping from happening in the first place. It's an accurate representation of a complicated and confrontational sisterly relationship, and I liked that. I liked the novel's ending. I like the fact that I can predict the next novel will be comparing Feyre's past mortal life with her now immortal one. At least I hope that it does. It doesn't leave you hanging for 4 books when you're almost certain of the character's fate, much like some other certain YA series did. I like the fact that in the sequel Feyre will have to navigate a relationship with Tamlin that she originally thought was finite, which has since become an immortal one. Will that subtract from the romance? Will it create conflict? Will it make it better? I'm excited to see. And I'm excited to hear more and read more about the other courts as well. I am confused why each book of the ACOTAR series weren't named after the courts themselves. E.g. the first book would be called The Spring Court, the next one The Night Court. I just feel like it would make more sense. Unless Maas knew before writing that these events would not take place across all of Privian and only across 1 or 2 of the lands instead, which I hope doesn't happen. I'm intrigued to see how all the different courts function. I want to meet all of these high fairies. Are they all gonna have abs? Is Feyre gonna romance them all? Go and get it, girl. Speaking of romance, I liked the romance between Feyre and Tamlin. Once you push past the fact that he manipulates her into breaking a curse for him. Unsurprisingly, the romance is one of the main attractions of the series to many ACOTAR fans, and from the many posts and stories proclaiming various ships I've seen online, I imagine I will be witnessing many love triangle plots later in the series following the introduction of bad boy Rhysand. I'm interested to see how that will happen and whether I'll actually enjoy these love triangles, because I like Tamlin. I thought he was a very Mr. Darcy inspired hottie. He has a prejudice against Feyre and is very awkward and uncomfortable with her at first because he knows how much meaning she could come to have for him, but he doesn't want to force her, but he's also starting to fall in love with her, and I like that. But for a Beauty and the Beast rewrite, he isn't really a beast to me in the sense that there is a major vein of confrontation between him and Feyre to overcome. Feyre actually gets over her kidnapping pretty quick once she learns her family are safe and comfortable, and he pretty much tells her she's allowed to leave and explore Privian whenever she wants, but you know, I liked him. He seems shy and awkward, and I kind of like that in a man, although he does seem to have a bad habit of appearing at just about any time that he wants, which is kind of creepy. However, that scene in the kitchen during that fairy festival, Calanmai, was a romance A+ in my book, and I liked seeing a more dominant side to Tamlin, who is on the majority pretty passive throughout the novel. I also appreciated the fact that Feyre is 19 and already has some previous experience in the romance area. She's definitely more of a character that older YA readers who have experienced sexual and romantic relationships could relate to. Normally you find that all of these YA female protagonists are around the ages of 16 to 17, and so they're obviously more out of touch or anxious or vulnerable to ideas of sex because they're minors. Most of the time, sex in YA series doesn't even play a part until later into the books when characters have had time to grow and develop, so it was kind of refreshing to read a narrative from the perspective of a young female who is actually confident and expressive about her sexuality and her desires. But that being said, the sex scenes in this book, whilst limited, felt like they went from 0 to 100. I think this tweet firmly sums it up. Maybe because ACOTAR is a YA book, so I was just not expecting the sex to come up as explicitly as it did, was why they surprised me so much. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate well-written sex scenes and I enjoy reading them. I think they're a necessary part of showcasing and advocating ideas of female autonomy and self-expression when it comes from the female perspective. We all know the real reason why 50 Shades of Grey was so controversial when it gained commercial success, and it wasn't just because it was bad. But the sex scenes in ACOTAR just felt kind of out of place compared to the context and tone of the rest of the book. Everything was fairly PG up until that point, and judging by the kind of articles and controversy that arises when you Google the book's name, yeah. So I think it isn't so much the sex scenes themselves that offended, but the inclusion of them in a genre that is majorly consumed by readers split between adults and young adults, or, you know, children. I think they would have had less controversial payoff if they were marketed and written for the adult fantasy romance instead, but I understand why they chose YA. It's much easier to gain a true and devoted following from younger fans than it is from older ones. Anyhow, I think that's a good segue into my next topic, what I disliked about this series. This is a very personal nitpick of mine, but fairies are a weird supernatural creature to write a sexy romance about. In my household, from around the age of 6, I grew up believing fairies were these cute little beings that took your baby teeth in exchange for pocket money, and that lived in tree trunks and mushrooms, and that came to deliver my Christmas presents when I was terrified of the idea of a strange old man coming down my chimney. Boy, was I wrong. I did not picture them as these sexy brooding warriors with abs, so all throughout the book I just kind of had to picture them as like elves from Lord of the Rings, because it was the only way that made the romance between Tamlin and Feyr-ugh work for me. Their abilities also confused me. The fact that Tamlin is first introduced in his wolfy beast form made me assume that he was going to be a shapeshifter werewolf hybrid thing, but then he's described as a fairy who can also do other supernatural things like summon tables with food on them out of nowhere like Dumbledore, and transform others into beings like he's taken a bunch of transfiguration lessons, but he's also super fast and super strong like Edward Cullen. Just picture all of the sexy, supernatural and magical qualities you've ever heard about in fantasy and paranormal romance and combine them into one and you have Tamlin. That's not to say that I believe Dumbledore is sexy. I don't. but who knows, that might float your boat. Leading off of my last point, the magic system and plot is kind of complicated and confusing. I often found myself rereading parts of the book multiple times because I just didn't get how the system worked right away. There's all these different lands and there's some lesser fairies that have powers, but most high fae don't, apart from the select few that do. But at the same time, there are also monsters in the land that are kind of fairies too. Does this make the giant worm Feyre fights at the end of the book of fairy too? I don't know. Maybe I just didn't get it, and I'll get more a feel for the system as the series goes on, but I just felt like I needed a whole other book, i.e. Hogwarts or history, to inform me of the magic system again. And in my opinion, the debut book of a series shouldn't do that. I thought the book was too long. I thought the plot of the last 128 pages felt so out of place and Hunger Games-y compared to the rest of the book. It was just, I didn't really enjoy it. It felt so hurried and forced. I actually feel like it might have paid off had Maas stuck to the Beauty and the Beast rewrite more strictly and had Isaac try and kill Tamlin off once he heard Feyre had been kidnapped and taken away. But Maas makes these fairies these unstoppable beings to mortals, so I think she kind of wrote herself into the corner with that one. Feyre. There are some interesting elements to her character, but I felt like as a protagonist she was just kind of copied and pasted out of every other YA book. What makes her special is that she's not special, but at the same time she's also not like other girls or humans that Tamlin has met. She has two beautiful, ethereal beings fall for her, and she's the most emotionally unaccommodating character I've ever read. Her voice is practically the same as every other YA female protagonist I've ever read, bar a few good exceptions. I enjoyed reading about her prickly relationship with her family. I thought the relationship she had with each family member was unique and individual, but then she gets taken away from them, so the one aspect of her character I really enjoyed reading about was also taken away too. I felt the fact that Feyre was illiterate was a pretty useful addition to her character for Maas to make. It makes sense that her character is so prickly when she is clearly so self-conscious about what she can and can't do. And I think it's clever that as a result of her illiteracy, Feyre is thus forced to describe the world around her as elements of art rather than as descriptive prose. But as for Feyre herself, she's not my favourite. Isaac is the most pointless character ever. He is Feyre's former lover, but I don't even think there's any dialogue between them in the book. Correct me if I'm wrong. His only function is to employ a weak, minute jealousy plot in order for Tamlin to realise his affection for Feyre, even though Tamlin's been alive literally hundreds of years and it's inferred he's basically had sex with more fairies than he can count, so who is he to judge? The Suriel. He's literally only there to warn Feyre to stay with Tamlin and doesn't appear again. I imagine that he'll probably pop up at perfect moments to give strange, ambiguous advice later in the books, but other than his one appearance in here when Feyre spares his life when she's been attacked by the Naga, he doesn't come back again, and his strange predictions are just kind of gone and vanish and become meaningless. I was kind of hoping he would pop up out of the end when she's having a kind of standoff with the baddie, but he doesn't. Andras, his character was just such a weird aspect of the curse over the Spring Court to me. Amarantha basically places a curse upon the Spring Court that weakens their powers and allows dangerous fairy monsters onto their court because Tamlin refuses to fall in love with her. Fun fact, the curse also turns his heart into stone, but more on that later. To break the curse, a mortal human has to kill a fairy with hate in her heart and later proclaim to Tamlin that she's in love with him with true devotion. I think it's supposed to come off that the curse Amarantha places over the Spring Court is so specific because she's so evil and so it'll be harder to break. but it's so overcomplicated that it ruins it for me. And judging by Tamlin's reaction when he literally intrudes on Feyre's cottage and kidnaps her, you'd think Andras and Tamlin were like besties or something. But when Feyre finally arrives at Tamlin's massive estate, everyone just kind of stops caring and stops hating her for killing Andras and are over it. This makes sense later in the context of the book when you find out that Andras actually sacrificed himself so that the curse over the Spring Court could be broken. But I thought this part could have been written so much better if Tamlin had genuine hate he had to get over because Feyre killed one of his closest friends. But nope. Lucien. I think this one's going to be controversial. I think he was there to employ some kind of comic relief, but I just didn't click with his character. He and Feyre are part of an enemies to friends narrative, but does he ever even hate Feyre? Like, does he? Were they ever enemies? They have this weird conversation about how much they dislike each other earlier in the book, and Lucien's really horrible to her at first, and he even hesitates to save her life because she killed Andras, but then they suddenly become besties the rest of the way through. He even helps her in one of the trials at risk of losing his life, and it's like, why? Don't you still hate her? Would you potentially sacrifice yourself to help your enemy? Clare Beddor. I get the point of this character when Rhysand asks what Clare Beddor. I get the point of this character when Rhysand asks what Feyre's name is. She gives her the name of Clare, who is a girl from her village, which first of all is dumb. Could you not think of any other name? And because of that, Clare is ultimately tortured and murdered by Amarantha, and Clare's family is burnt to death in order to force Tamlin to become betrothed to Amarantha. Clare's purpose is to show how unrestrained and unhitched Amarantha really is as a villain, and how she'll stop at nothing to take pleasure in people's pain or to show mortals how mortal they really are. But this would have been so much more effective as a plot if Feyre actually knew Clare. She knew her, but they weren't friends or anything. There's no actual dialogue or interaction between them, at least not described in the book, and the only thing we really hear from her is from Elaine. So if Maas was trying to create a scene to generate a sense of sympathy and shock value, I think a friendship complex between Clare and Feyre would have been so much more effective. Feyre's father. Oh my god, Feyre's dad could have been killed off and I would not have shed a tear. He doesn't deserve her, she doesn't even really like or ever even really talks to him. He's the most pointless character ever written. Those creditors could have beaten him to death before the book's events, and the plot of ACOTAR would not have changed in any way whatsoever. We have to talk about the Stone Heart plot. I told you it was coming back. So later on, Feyre's trial to win back Tamlin, she has to do three, by the way. One of them, featuring the aforementioned giant worm, is to stab 3 high fairies whose faces are concealed underneath sacks. And at first I thought this was going to be a family, and I thought, oh my god, this is great. Not that Feyre being forced to murder her family is great, but you have to admit it would be an amazing plot point. But no, it turns out to be 3 random fairies that she has to stab with daggers, and the last is finally revealed to be, surprise, Tamlin himself. Here it's coincidentally revealed and remembered by Feyre that Tamlin, because of the curse, actually has a stone heart. And she knows this because she doesn't remember it beating in all of the times they've been together. But it's not even mentioned before that. If that's such a significant aspect to the outcome of the plot, why was it not brought up earlier? I don't want to insult Maas because she's obviously a very talented and intelligent woman to have received the success that she has, but this part of the narrative felt like an afterthought she had forgotten about and that she had to quickly remedy in some way. So, at the start of the book, it's revealed that humans believe that fairies can't lie, which I thought was such an interesting idea. It was like, oh, how is Maas going to navigate these enemies and plot points when there's no room for the usual kind of deception? But then this idea is turned on its head when Lucien and Tamlin laugh at Feyre over dinner for believing all of the superstitions and old wives' tales surrounding fairies, and it's like, what was the point? Also, after Feyre is essentially kidnapped, you find out that her family have been placed under a glamour that makes them forget the trauma that happened when they witnessed Feyre get kidnapped by Giant Wolf Man. They think she went to stay with an imaginary wealthy aunt, and that their fortune, which Tamlin actually bestows on them, is a consequence of just extreme good luck. But when Feyre decides to go back to rescue Tamlin from Amarantha, her family suddenly remembers the reason for why she left again. But why did she even go back in the first place? Tamlin sends her there to keep her safe, but she's only there for the duration of about 6 pages before she returns to Spring Court again. I get that it follows the Beauty and the Beast narrative and that Maas has to put those narrative plot points in somewhere for it to be true to the original fairy tale, but what was the point? And do the other installments follow the stories of fairies' tales too? If not, then why does ACOTAR? The Mortal World. I want to know more about it. You hear Feyre and her younger sister Elaine often talk about the continent, but what is it? The map shown in the front pages of the book that makes up the Mortal World and the world of Privian looks like it's supposed to be made up of the UK, or at least what used to be the UK, in a kind of fairy dystopia. But again, I'm not 100% sure of that because it's never really brought up or explained. On the plus side, I would be down here, meaning I would have been a surviving mortal, so yay, at least there's that. I'm hoping that this concept of land and fairy colonialism will be explored later in the series. Is the continent also occupied by fairies, or is it just mortals? If so, why did the fairies only end up invading the UK? It's not a very wide expanse of land. Likewise, if it is set in the real world, then what time period is the book actually set in? There's mercenaries running around and there's swords and candlelight, but there's also ballrooms, so is it not in fact set in a future where fairies have invaded, but is actually a past alternate universe set in the medieval or the Regency period, which are also grossly far apart chronologically? I have questions. I'm realising now that my dislikes and confusion for this series kind of outweigh my likes for this book, but despite that I still really enjoyed reading ACOTAR. I read it pretty much in one day. I think for me it definitely verges on the trashier end of YA fantasy fiction, but that's not a bad thing. It has all the facets of a pleasurable, easy reading YA fantasy novel, unlike something like Six of Crows or Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo, which I think is of a much higher concise writing quality than this particular fantasy's counterpart. But ACOTAR was good. There were parts when it was slow and the world building and the plot were overcomplicated and hard to navigate for a first time reader of the series, but overall I liked it. And I think even though I found it a bit lackluster despite all the hype and the rave reviews, I will be reading the next instalment because Maas knows how to write a good ending. So if you'd like me to read A Court of Mist and Fury and share my thoughts, or indeed want me to share any thoughts about any particular series or books at all, please leave a suggestion in the comments or at me on Twitter or Instagram and I will happily read them. Did you like ACOTAR? Do you agree with my opinions? Let me know your thoughts. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. This is my very first book commentary video I've ever posted. I've wanted to do one in forever, so let me know how I did. But until next time, farewell.